The morning the season opened its doors, Cecily Hartwell wore a gown of dove-gray cambric that had been let out once at the seams, and pressed so carefully that a woman who did not know better might almost have mistaken it for deliberate restraint. She stood at the far edge of the Grantham Assembly Room, where the candlelight thinned toward the curtained windows, and she held a glass of ratafia she did not intend to drink. And she listened to Lady Dorothea Ashmore say, in the carrying voice of a woman who had never once needed to lower it, that poor Miss Hartwell had come to the season with nothing but her father's debts and a great deal of misplaced hope. The words traveled across 3 conversations and arrived at Cecily's ears with perfect clarity. She did not flinch. She had been practicing not flinching for the better part of 6 months, ever since the solicitor Mr. Silas Croft had come to Hartwell Hall in the January rain and read her the terms of the entail in a voice that was kind, precisely because it could afford to be. 412 acres, her father's hands had shaped them, and the law proposed to take them from her, as though they were a borrowed shawl returned at the end of an evening. She had listened to Croft with the same stillness she now employed against Lady Dorothea, and afterward she had gone to the kitchen garden and stood in the cold until she could breathe again without her chest feeling like a room with no windows. What she had not told Croft, what she had told no one, was that her father had left something else. A codicil, drafted in his careful, slanting hand, witnessed and sealed and held in Croft's own strongbox. Thomas Hartwell had loved his daughter with the quiet ferocity of a man who could not repair the world, but had, in his final months, found one precise way to make it inconvenient for the world to ruin her. The codicil named her heir to Hartwell Hall by a provision that predated the standard entail document by 3 days. 3 days. Croft had confirmed it was valid. Cecily had told him to say nothing of it until she gave him leave. She was 23 years old, and she had spent her inheritance of patience learning when to speak and when to be still. The assembly room smelled of beeswax and powder and the faint sweetness of too many hothouse flowers brought into paper over an English January. Ladies in ivory and pale gold and rose moved across the floor like petals in a current, and the gentlemen circled them in their dark coats with the practiced ease of men who had never had to consider whether they belonged. Cecily watched them without envy and with only the faintest edge of something she might have called wry recognition. The way one watches a game played by different rules than the ones one was given at birth. It was in this posture, glass in hand, expression composed to the industry of a woman examining nothing in particular, that she first saw Lord Edmund Ashmore, the Earl of Reston, stand at the entrance to the main hall and survey the room as though he were calculating its yield. He was not a man one missed. He stood 2 inches above most of the other men present and held himself with the particular stillness of someone who had learned, at considerable cost, that stillness was more effective than movement. His jaw was the kind of thing sculptors reached for when they needed to indicate self-command. His eyes, even at 30 feet, were a gray so pale they registered almost as absence, and they moved across the assembly room in a steady sweep that paused on nothing long enough to suggest interest. His cravat was impeccable. His coat was dark and without ornament. He did not look like a man who had come to enjoy himself. He looked like a man who had come to conduct a transaction and expected it to be completed before supper. Lady Dorothea appeared at his elbow within 30 seconds, and beside her, a young woman in diamond-white silk who moved as though she knew the room had been waiting for her. Cecily registered the young woman's face, which was genuinely lovely, and apparently aware of the fact, and the cut of her gown, which had been designed to ensure that plainness elsewhere in the room would feel the full weight of the comparison. This was Miss Arabella Vane, though Cecily did not know her name yet. She learned it 4 minutes later from Mrs. Pendleton, who materialized at her side to murmur that the vain girl was Lady Dorothea's own particular project this season, and that the match with Lord Reston was considered as good as settled in all the houses that mattered. Mrs. Pendleton did not appear to notice Cecily's expression. Cecily was composed. She had been composing herself since January. 2 days later, Edmund came to Hartwell Hall. He arrived in a black carriage with the Reston crest on the panel, and he brought with him a steward named Mr. Graves, a ledger, and the air of a man who had already decided the outcome of the meeting and was being courteous enough to proceed through the formalities regardless. Cecily received them in the old oak-paneled sitting room that had been her father's favorite, because it was the room that felt most fully like a room that belonged to her, and because the light there in the late morning was clean and honest and did not flatter pretension. Edmund looked at her for exactly the length of time it takes to assign a social category, and then looked at the ledger Graves had opened on the table. He was polite. His manners were without reproach. He offered £8,000 for 412 acres of working Hertfordshire estate with a sound main house and 2 standing tenant farms, and he noted that the sum reflected the estate's current encumbered state, as the £3,200 in outstanding debt against the property would need to be satisfied from any proceeds. He said all of this clearly, without emphasis or apology, as a man states the terms of a practical arrangement that benefits all parties. Then he said, almost as a corollary, that he understood she had come to the season, and he hoped she would find it useful, because a woman in her position would benefit from making the practical arrangements the season was designed to facilitate, and that a woman of her sort was. He chose his words with professional care, largely invisible to men of his station in the social sense. He meant it, Cecily understood, as a kind assessment. He was telling her not to mistake the season for a place where she would be seen, so that she might redirect her energies more profitably. She was still for a moment that stretched 3 seconds longer than comfort would have suggested was natural. Then she said that she would require a fortnight to consider his offer, that she thanked him for his time, and that she trusted the roads back to Reston Park were navigable given the weather. Her voice was even, and her hands were folded in her lap, and not one muscle in her face moved that she had not given permission to move. Edmund paused for the first time since he had entered the room. His eyes came back to her face with something in them that was not the social category assessment of 4 minutes before. It was briefer than attention and more precise than glance. Then he inclined his head, said he would await her answer, and left with Graves and the ledger. The carriage had not yet cleared the drive when Cecily unfolded her hands and pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed once, deeply, through her nose. She had not expected to keep feeling the words. She had thought herself beyond that particular vulnerability. She had been wrong. The fortnight passed. She went to 2 further assemblies, a musicale at the Hargrove House, and a card evening she could not politely refuse, and at each one she stood in her gray cambric or her dark green wool, which was newer but not much richer, and she was correctly greeted and promptly forgotten, and the label that Lady Dorothea had applied in the Grantham Assembly Room traveled ahead of her like a calling card. Poor Miss Hartwell, nothing but her father's debts, a great deal of misplaced hope. She heard the phrase again at the Hargrove Musicale, this time in a voiced exchange between 2 women whose names she did not bother to retain, who were standing behind a pillar with the comfortable carelessness of people who had never needed to consider that walls carried sound. She let it pass through her the way cold water passes through cupped hands. She was learning which hurts were functional and which were ornamental, and the distinction was clarifying. On the 4th day after the Hargrove Musicale, she rode to the Hartwell South Farm to speak with the Tilson family about a fence line that needed repairing before the spring lambing season. She found instead that Mr. Graves had arrived ahead of her. He was standing in the yard with a notice in his hand and an expression of bureaucratic regret that she recognized as the face men wore when they were doing something they had been told was technically correct. The notice, he explained, was a formal request that the Tilson tenancy be cleared by the end of the month, as Lord Reston wished to review the farm's lease arrangements prior to any transfer of the property. Mrs. Tilson stood in the cottage doorway with a 2-year-old girl balanced on her hip, and her eldest boy, who was perhaps 9, standing straight beside her in the way boys stand when they have been told not to cry in front of strangers. The baby was coughing. The morning air was cold enough to see breath. Cecily looked at Graves's notice, and then at Mrs. Tilson's face, and then at the boy who was standing straight. And she did something she had not precisely planned to do. She said, in a clear and unhurried voice, that the Tilson tenancy was a matter governed by the current holder of Hartwell Hall, which was herself, and that until a legal transfer of title was completed and witnessed by Mr. Croft, no notice issued by Lord Reston's steward carried any force on this land. She said it the way one states a matter of arithmetic. She asked Graves to convey her regards to his lordship. She waited while he folded the notice and put it in his pocket and climbed back onto his horse, and she waited until the sound of the hooves had diminished down the lane before she turned back to Mrs. Tilson, whose free hand was pressed against her mouth. Cecily stayed another 2 hours. She mended the fence line herself with the 9-year-old's help, because the boy needed somewhere to put his energy, and she had learned from her father that there was nothing wrong with work as a remedy. She did not notice the stillness from the lane. She did not notice the gray horse standing at the verge of the road, its rider motionless beneath the line of beeches, watching the yard with his pale eyes, and an expression that a casual observer might have read as nothing in particular. Edmund had come to speak with Graves. He had arrived in time to hear only the end of what Cecily had said. But it was enough. He remained at the lane's edge for a full minute after she turned away, and the quality of his stillness changed in a way that had nothing to do with calculation. He came to Hartwell Hall the following morning without the ledger. Cecily received him in the same sitting room and did not offer tea, because she was still measuring what she knew of him, and offering tea was a signal of welcome she had not yet decided to send. He stood with his hat in his hands, which was the first time she had seen him hold something that was not a document, and he said that he understood the Tilson notice had been premature, and that he had spoken with Graves on the matter. He said it plainly, without embellishment. She acknowledged the statement with equal plainness. There was a silence between them that was not precisely comfortable, but was not hostile either, the way a room feels when furniture has been moved and the proportions are still being settled. He asked, with a care that was not quite casual, whether she found the season agreeable. She said that she found it instructive. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had first caught at the negotiating table, the one that was not a category assessment. Then he said that he had wondered, and he did not finish the sentence, and for the first time in their acquaintance he appeared not to have the next word ready. She did not help him find it. She had decided she would not perform the courtesy of making things easy for a man who had told her she was invisible. He left 20 minutes later, having concluded, ostensibly, nothing. He paused once at the door of the sitting room and looked back at the portrait of Thomas Hartwell above the mantel. The portrait showed a plain-featured man with her same dark eyes and her same particular quality of attention, the look of someone engaged in reading a room at a deeper level than the surface offered. Edmund looked at the portrait for 3 seconds. Then he went. Lady Dorothea gave a ball at Reston Park on the 15th of February, and the party she assembled for it was so precisely arranged as to constitute a statement of intent. Arabella arrived on the arm of her mother in ice-blue silk with seed pearls at her collar, and the placement at dinner put her at Edmund's left hand and placed Cecily 7 seats down between a retired general with impaired hearing and a young baronet who spent the meal describing his intention to acquire a bloodhound. The evening's particular architecture was not accidental. Dorothea moved through it with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had been building this room for 40 years and knew precisely how it was supposed to end. At the set dances after supper, Edmund stood with Arabella for the first and opened the floor. He danced correctly. He spoke by appearances. With reasonable animation, Cecily watched from the chairs where the unremarkable women sat and noted that he turned correctly on every beat and that his eyes spent rather more time on a fixed point above Arabella's shoulder than on her face. The eyes of a man completing a duty rather than a man in the presence of something that had his interest. She told herself this observation was irrelevant. She believed herself to be correct in this, and she was wrong, and the wrongness was going to cost her something she had not yet calculated. It was 3 days after the Reston ball that she saw Edmund with his son. She had come to the park at Reston on a matter of property boundary clarification, a practical question that required Croft's attention and could not be deferred, and she had been shown into the library to wait. The library was a long, quiet room with tall windows facing the north garden, and the north garden, in the February afternoon light, held a boy of 7 years old who was sitting on the stone edge of a dormant fountain and throwing pebbles at a stick he had propped against the basin. Not playing, precisely, but occupying himself at the careful distance from pleasure that children maintain when they are not certain pleasure is permitted. Edmund emerged from the terrace door at the far end of the garden. The boy saw him and stopped throwing the pebbles. He did not run toward him. He sat with his small hands folded in his lap in a manner that was so exact a replica of the posture Cecily had used at the negotiating table that she felt something move in her chest that she could not immediately account for. Edmund crouched at the boy's level, which was not what Cecily had expected. He said something. The boy, George, looked at the pebble in his hand, rather than at his father's face. Edmund remained crouching for a full 2 minutes while the boy studied the pebble, and then George said something in return, very briefly, and went back inside through the terrace door without taking his father's hand. Edmund straightened. He stood looking at the closed terrace door, with an expression that was so specifically the face of a man carrying something. He did not know how to set down that Cecily had to look away from the window. Croft arrived 10 minutes later and explained, in a careful murmur, while Edmund was still in the garden, that the late Countess of Reston had died 18 months ago of a fever contracted on a journey Edmund had asked her not to make. He had asked her not to make it because the weather was uncertain and she was not fully recovered from a previous illness. She had made it regardless to see her son through his first weeks at the preparatory school, and she had not come back. George had understood, in the imprecise and absolute way of 6-year-old children, that his mother had died on an errand his father had disapproved, and the architecture of blame a child constructs from that fact was not a thing that could be argued away with logic or love. Cecily stood in the library with Croft's quiet words settling over her and thought of her father's portrait and the way Edmund had looked at it. And she was quiet for a long moment. If you have stayed with this story so far, leave a thought in the comments. These are the moments that matter, and knowing you are here matters to the people who make them. Edmund came in from the garden looking like a man who had composed himself for company, which meant he had given his expression the exact surface of a man who had not just stood outside a closed door. Cecily met him with the same composed surface she gave the world, and found, for the first time, that the composure felt less like armor and more like recognition. Two people maintaining the same practiced stillness for different griefs. They discussed the boundary question for 40 minutes. He was precise and fair. He asked once, without evident purpose beyond the question itself, whether the Tilson baby's cough had improved. She said the baby was well, and she watched something ease almost imperceptibly in the line of his shoulders, and she filed this observation in the place where she kept the things she did not yet know what to do with. He walked her to the front door himself, rather than summoning a footman, and at the door he said that he hoped the season had grown more agreeable, with a very small weight on the word that she chose to hear as acknowledgment of what he had said the first time, and she said that it had grown more interesting, with an equivalent weight on that word, and he looked at her for a count of 3 with the pale gray eyes that were not. She was revising her assessment, like absence at all. They were like the sky before weather arrives. She rode home with the boundary documents in her satchel and a particular quality of silence inside her that she could not have named in company. The intimacy between them deepened in small, careful increments that each carried a plausible deniability. He contrived to be in the Hartwell Library twice in the following weeks, once to return a property map that Graves had mislaid, and once on no pretense that either of them acknowledged. He stood at the shelves and pulled out a volume of agricultural surveys and read 3 sentences of it while she sat at the desk with the estate accounts, and neither of them spoke for 20 minutes, and the silence was more candid than any of the conversations they had managed. He found her in the garden, in the thin March light, cutting back the dead wood from the rose beds herself, because the gardener, old Merton, was 71, and the March cold was hard on his hands. Edmund took the clippers from her without asking, and worked in silence down the row, and she followed him with the basket, and when he gave the clippers back, his fingers brushed her gloved hand, and neither of them looked at it. At the Pemberton dinner in mid-March, he was seated across the table from her, and she felt, twice, that particular quality of attention that registers in the skin before it registers in the mind, and both times, when she looked up, his eyes were on his plate, and both times the line of his jaw was doing something that was not quite a muscle and not quite a thought. Arabella was at the dinner, too. She was at most of the same dinners. She was everywhere that Lady Dorothea assembled the season's serious candidates, and her conversation was bright and well deployed, and she was, in almost every measurable way, the correct answer to the question the season was posing. Cecily understood this with complete clarity, and no malice. Arabella had been prepared for this purpose the way a key is prepared for a specific lock. That the lock's owner appeared increasingly unwilling to use it was not Arabella's fault. Lady Dorothea had begun to understand that something was not proceeding as planned. The understanding arrived for her the way unwelcome recognitions always do, as a series of small wrong notes that individually mean nothing and together mean everything. The way Edmund's eyes tracked across the room at the Pemberton dinner. The second visit to Hartwell Hall, which Graves mentioned without realizing he was mentioning it. The rose garden, which one of the hall's kitchen girls had apparently seen, and found sufficiently remarkable to share with the cook, who had told the footman, who had told the housekeeper of Reston Park. Dorothea processed each note with the swift economy of a woman who had spent 40 years reading social weather, and what she heard was a specific storm approaching from a direction she had not prepared a defense against. She escalated. She invited Mrs. Pendleton to take tea at Reston Park in the 3rd week of March, and over the tea she mentioned, with the calibrated regret of a woman performing reluctance, that poor Miss Hartwell was a creature to be pitied rather than censured, naturally, given her circumstances, but that a woman with nothing behind her except a failing estate and £3,200 of her father's debt was not precisely the material from which a countess was made. She said it with great kindness. She said it in a room with 5 other women who were all listening with the attentive ears of people who had been given something useful to carry. By the following Tuesday, it had circulated through enough drawing rooms to constitute a fact. On the last Friday of March, Lady Dorothea held a dinner party at Reston Park, to which she invited 40 guests and the solicitor who had recently managed the Vane family's trust arrangements, a detail that was not incidental. After the meal and before the dancing, in the high-ceilinged drawing room with all 40 guests assembled and the candles burning at full dress evening height, Dorothea produced a document. She produced it with the unhurried deliberateness of a woman who had been saving it for the room that deserved it. And she spoke in the clear, carrying voice that had always been her particular instrument. She said that she had taken the liberty of having the matter of Hartwell Hall's title reviewed as a kindness to all parties and a matter of legal clarity before any further negotiations proceeded, and that the document she held confirmed a deed of conveyance that predated the codicil Miss Hartwell had been relying upon, meaning that the estate had already passed, by legal right, to the entailed male heir, and that Miss Hartwell's claim to it was, with great sorrow, without foundation. The room was very quiet. 40 people shifted their weight in their chairs and on their feet, in the way 40 people shift when they have witnessed something and are waiting to see whether it will require them to respond. Arabella stood beside Dorothea with an expression that was carefully composed to sympathetic regret. Edmund across the room had gone so still that he was a point in space rather than a person. Cecily stood 3 feet from the mantelpiece, in her dark green wool, with her father's words in her ears, and 3,200 pounds of his debt on the estate she had just been told she did not own. The label came back with the full weight of the context Dorothea had built for it over the course of the season, and this time it was not a whisper behind a pillar or a murmur at a tea table. This time it was spoken clearly before witnesses, with a document as its authority. Poor Miss Hartwell. The woman with nothing behind her. Cecily set her wine-glass on the mantelpiece with great care, as though it were something breakable that deserved respect. She said, to no one in particular, and to everyone present, that she would be grateful if someone would send for Mr. Croft. Graves, who was standing near the door, glanced at Edmund. Edmund said, in the quiet, level way he had, to send for Mr. Croft. It was the voice of a man issuing a command. It was also, Cecily understood, the voice of a man who was, for the first time, stepping into the line of something rather than behind it. Croft arrived in 22 minutes, which suggested he had not been far. He was a spare, composed man of 50, with a leather case under his arm and a face designed by nature for the delivery of consequential information without editorial color. He came into the drawing room, greeted the assembled company with one level nod, and asked to see the document Lady Dorothea held. He looked at it for 60 seconds. He looked at it the way a man looks at a thing he has been expecting and has been ready for. Then he opened his leather case and produced a document of his own. The codicil was 3 pages in Thomas Hartwell's careful hand, witnessed by 2 men whose names were known to everyone in the room, bearing a date 3 days before the deed Lady Dorothea had presented. Croft read the operative clause in full, without haste, in the voice he used for facts that did not require inflection to carry their weight. The provision was clear, and the precedence was clear, and the forgery in Dorothea's document, which Croft noted with professional brevity, was detectable by reference to the seal's date stamp, was now a matter for discussion between Lady Dorothea and her own advisers at their separate convenience. The room was quieter than it had been before. This was a different quality of quiet, the quiet of a verdict landing rather than a verdict pending. Cecily stood with her hands at her sides and her breathing steady. She was the owner of 412 acres, and a sound main house and 2 standing tenant farms, and 1 document that had waited quietly in Croft's strongbox for the moment when it was needed. Patient as a promise. Edmund crossed the room. He crossed it in the way she had been told no man of his station crossed a room toward a woman of her sort, steadily and without consulting the opinion of anyone present, and the 40 witnesses turned in the way rooms turn when the room's most significant person decides the room's geography. He stopped 2 feet from her and looked at her with the pale gray eyes that were, she had long since revised, nothing like absence. They were the color of the sky when weather has cleared, and what comes after is open and new, and has no name yet. He said that he owed her an apology for what he had said at their first meeting, and that he had owed it for some time, and that he hoped she would accept it. His voice was the same level voice he always used, but there was nothing in it that was performance. It was the voice of a man who had arrived at a decision after a long, careful journey and was not going to depart from it because 40 people were watching. He said that he would be deeply honored if she would allow him to call upon her, in the formal sense, with her consent and at her discretion. He did not say he loved her. It was not the kind of thing he would say in a drawing room in front of 40 people. But he used her first name. He said Miss Cecily, which was not quite the formal address and not quite the informal one, and was precisely in the vocabulary they had been developing across February and March in libraries and gardens and silences, the most exact word for what he meant. Behind him, Lady Dorothea looked at the document in her hand, and then at the 40 faces around her, and then at her son's back. And something in her face went through 2 or 3 expressions rapidly, and arrived at one that was quieter than the others. The face of a woman who has found the limit of the map she was given, and is beginning, at some cost, to understand that the territory beyond it is real. Arabella, to her credit, looked at Edmund and then at Cecily, and then down at her own lovely hands, and withdrew from the center of the room as gracefully as she had entered it. Her part in this evening had concluded, and she knew it. Cecily looked at Edmund for a long moment. She was 23 years old, and she had spent 6 months learning to receive cruelty without flinching. And she was not, even now, a woman who expressed her relief in the form that would have satisfied a watching crowd. She said, quietly and precisely, that she would be glad to receive him. Then she picked up her wine-glass from the mantelpiece, because it had been set down with intention, and it could now be set down differently. And she turned back to the room with the composure of a woman who had held something with both hands for a very long time, and had just been offered somewhere to put it. It would be sufficient here to say that if Cecily's courage in this room has moved you, leave a word below. These stories belong to the people who stay for them. Edmund came to Hartwell Hall the following morning, at the hour Cecily had named, which was 10 o'clock, because 10 o'clock was honest and practical, and not arranged to seem either eager or indifferent. He came without Graves and without the ledger. He brought his son. George was 7 years old and small for his age, and had his father's pallor and his mother's dark eyes and the particular self-containment of a child who has learned that the world is not reliably safe and is still deciding whether to revise this assessment. He stood in the hall of Hartwell Hall and looked at the floor, and then at the walls, and then at the portrait of Thomas Hartwell above the sitting-room mantel, which he appeared to find interesting in the same considered way his father had. Cecily said to him that she had a piano in the music room that had not been played in 4 months, and that she suspected it was feeling neglected, and asked if he knew anything about pianos. He looked at her for the first time. He said very carefully that he had been learning. She said that the piano would be glad of that, and that if he wanted to see it, it was the second door on the left. He went to find it. Edmund watched his son disappear through the corridor with an expression that was undefended in a way Cecily had not seen in his face before, relief and grief, and something that was perhaps the beginning of the longer work of repair, the work that does not complete itself in a morning, but begins, sometimes, in one. He looked back at Cecily, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because the piano had just, very tentatively, begun to sound from the music room, a single chord tested, and then another. The careful explorations of a child determining whether a thing is trustworthy. Cecily said that she would accept his offer of £8,000 for Hartwell Hall, on the condition that the purchase formed part of the formal settlement of their engagement, so that the name on the deed remained Hartwell. Edmund looked at her with the weight of a man who has been understood, and said that those were very reasonable terms. He was not the first man who had offered her a future. He was the first man who had looked at her plainness and her debts, and her father's portrait, and her own particular quality of relentless, principled attention to the world, and had seen, steadily, over the course of February and March, what was actually there. The spring came in with wind, and then with light, and then, on the 1st of April, with snow, which was the kind of snow that arrives in spring, as though it has not been told the season has changed, small and clean and without accumulation, falling past the windows of Hartwell Hall in the fire-lit late evening, while Cecily sat at the writing desk with the estate accounts, and Edmund sat opposite her with the Reston correspondence, and said very little, because it was not a silence that required filling. George had stayed for supper and fallen asleep on the settee in the sitting room with a book open on his chest, and the fire had been built up against the cold, and Merton had brought in the last of the winter woodpile, and the hall smelled of old wood and cold air, and the particular quality of a house that has been, for a long time, waiting to be inhabited, rather than merely occupied. Thomas Hartwell's portrait had been brought down from the upstairs storeroom, where it had been placed during the uncertain months of the season, and rehung in its proper position above the sitting-room mantel. Edmund had carried it himself, which had required him to stand on the library steps with the portrait's heavy frame in his hands and Cecily steadying the base of the steps, and they had hung it level on the second attempt and stood back to look at it. Thomas Hartwell looked back at both of them with his particular quality of patient attention, and Edmund had said quietly that he could see the resemblance, and Cecily had said that her father would have respected a man who carried his own furniture, and Edmund had looked at her with the expression that was not quite a smile, but was the thing that lived in him just beside it, and it was the closest he had come in her presence to something unguarded. And it was enough. Outside the windows of Hartwell Hall, the spring snow fell soft against the glass, and inside the fire spoke to itself in the grate, and George turned on the settee in his sleep and pulled the book against his chest without waking, and Cecily looked up once from the accounts at Edmund's bent head in the firelight, the line of his jaw which she had come to read the way one reads a familiar landscape. And then she looked back down at the figures, which added up correctly, which had always added up correctly. And she did the last column and set down the pen, and thought that this was what it felt like to be in a room that was hers. Not because the deed said so, and not because the law confirmed it, but because the fire was her father's fire, and the portrait was her father's face, and the boy asleep on the settee had trusted the piano in her music room, and the man across the desk had crossed a drawing room full of witnesses to say her name. All of it, finally, hers. The snow continued to fall, and the candle on the desk burned low, and no one put it out. If Cecily's story stayed with you, leave a comment naming the moment that mattered most. And if you would like to be here when the next story begins, a quiet subscribe is how you find your way back.